But maybe we can just start with some, just to tell us about the residency and the installation, because I know there are various facets of it, Rachel. Obviously, these images are really great to see how the residency has been coming together. But can you just tell us about the kind of different aspects of this project?
Yeah, so there are 3 projects that are shown within the exhibition. So the overarching theme is hoping you are well, and which, as you might expect from the title, all of the projects evoke letter writing, these sort of phrases like take care or hope you are well that we used to use sort of without thinking, but that I think these days in pandemic times take on a new sort of urgency. And so the Taking Care project is what I'm working on when I'm in residence. This is a project that I began in 2018. That has happened sort of episodically a couple of times a year since then, where I take time to be in residence somewhere for an intensive period. The idea is that it's a participatory project where visitors are invited to write a letter in which they remember a time when they felt cared for. Not when they cared for someone else, which I think we often do all the time, but when they actually felt cared for. And if they choose to write a letter and are willing to participate that way, then I take the time to care for their story in a sense by embroidering some of the words from their letter. So not the whole letter, not telling the whole story, but to give some visibility to an aspect of their experience, of their project. And that's some of what you see streaming here in these images. Some of them are a little longer and some of them are pretty short. But I try to, when I choose the words from the letters, I try to kind of evoke a little bit about the story, but also offer people an entry point, maybe into their own imagining. Like the one you just saw there, she always cut the toast on the diagonal, and you can imagine what kind of story that might have been from and how that represented an act of care that when someone felt cared for. The second project that's installed in there is a kind of data visualization installation. In some of the images you saw, I was putting pieces of paper up on the wall. It's called Pandemic Epistles. It's a project that I started in the middle of March last year when everything was shutting down. I decided to start a daily practice of writing 1 letter per day. And I've continued that. Today is day 272. If I'd known kind of how long it would go on, I'm not sure I would have necessarily started, but it's been a fascinating practice to have during the pandemic, partly because I've never had a daily practice before. And so there's definitely an element of endurance and duration, but it has also been incredibly rewarding, whether or not I hear back from the people I write to, just to make that gesture every day, to write to someone, to reach out, to connect. And I do have some active correspondence now, so that's exciting too. And then the third project that's on display in there, which you won't really see anything of, is an audio project. I guess you can see in that photo right there, you can see maybe a little speaker. I've been writing a series of letters to the future, sort of thinking about our possible futures, and some of those are in an audio recording voiced by friends of mine in different parts of the world, and that's on a loop in the gallery as well, so anybody who comes can listen to that as well.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that intrigues me is, as Gretchen mentioned in the introduction, that people are submitting letters during the residency. So have you received many letters since you started?
Yeah, I just started receiving them yesterday. I think some of them had arrived while I wasn't yet in residence or sort of in the in-between times. But yeah, I'm starting to receive a few. Oh, look, there they are pictured. There's a mail slot where they're delivered and they fall into a basket down there below. Yeah, I mean, and anytime I've installed the Taking Care project a few times now, and it's not like there's ever a flood of letters, because I think not everyone I mean, any kind of participatory project, not everybody takes you up on the invitation, but it also is an ask that requires time and a willingness to share something.
And it's physical letters. It's letters through the mailbox or letters through the mail system. It's not emails. It's not texts.
Exactly.
And why did you want people to take the time to write, in the old-fashioned way?
Oh, let's see. I mean, I think there's lots of reasons probably. I've been a letter writer my whole life, I think. I come from a long line of letter writers. But I also think for me, there's an element of time that's tied up with care. I think letters are a good approximation of the time we take to care for ourselves and to care for other people. And I think that the physical act of sitting down and writing a letter by hand maybe helps us think about our words in a different way, in a more intentional way, and helps us tell those stories in a better way than I think if we were just shooting off a text to somebody.
Well, it's less of a ping pong, isn't it? I mean, it's more of a concerted, focused, sort of, in a way, it's less reciprocal in the sense that it's more like, this is what I want to tell you, yes, on the assumption that there will be a reply, but it's not an immediate reply.
Yeah, definitely. There's I don't know, in a way, there's a risk involved, I think. You send something out. Anytime you write a letter, you send it out sort of maybe hoping, anticipating some sort of a response. But, if it comes, it may come quickly. It may come, months down the line, if ever. Yeah.
And I mean, when we chatted earlier in the week to just sort of talk through some ideas for this conversation, you were telling me how when you've done this project before, people will actually come into the gallery. So you've obviously had to change it due to our COVID times. How has that changed the project and your feelings about it?
I don't know, in some ways it hasn't changed it all that much. I do miss the interaction with visitors that I've had in previous installations, some one-on-one conversations, with total strangers about letter writing. But I think, it's just an opportunity to communicate in a different way, and maybe in a more intentional way, right, than just stopping by the gallery. They can share their thoughts with me through a letter instead if they want to have that connection. So I don't know, I think obviously the pandemic forces us to adapt in all kinds of ways, but I think it also offers us opportunities for new kinds of creativity, gives us a different set of constraints. Yeah. And I think this kind of letter writing project is well suited to that.
Well, it's poignant, isn't it, when in a way the act of not physically engaging with people and sort of staying home and not going out it can in itself be an act of care.
Right. So the isolation, sort of isolating myself in the gallery and not allowing people in, that you could certainly understand that as an act of care as well.
Yeah. And when you're selecting the phrases to embroider, is it really obvious to you, or do you spend quite a lot of time? What stands out? Why do you think you choose certain phrases?
I think it depends on the letter. Sometimes it's obvious right away, like what are the words that really evoke that story. I do try to spend quite a bit of time with the letters themselves to really think about, it's an intimacy. It's something that somebody's sharing with me, whether I know them or not. Maybe especially if I don't know them, it's an intimate gesture. And so I want to be respectful of that and honor that in a sense. So yeah, sometimes the words stand out quickly and other times I think it takes more time, but I do try to choose words that will allow you to imagine, I think, the story that's behind them, whether it's the real story or not. I don't think that really matters. I'm not interested in sort of exposing all of people's stories that they've shared with me, but I do want to give a glimpse of those.
And you do them, and does the embroidery reflect where they were on the page?
No, not necessarily, although sometimes the color reflects either the color of the paper or the color of the ink that was used. Yeah. But like the one I started embroidering yesterday, the words are, "He says my name, he loves me otherwise." And, and I love that idea that saying someone's name can be a gesture of care, and to think about what kind of contexts that might apply to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Obviously, this whole question of slowing down and spending time, taking time. I mean, this is, you've written a book on it, so it's something that's really central to your sort of philosophy. Why do you think that is so important? Why is that such a kind of valuable thing in our culture?
Well, that's sort of the quintessential question these days, right? The world spins ever faster, and how do we find our place in it without spinning out of control? I just think it's so imperative for human relations and for sort of human sanity to slow down in whatever ways make sense, whether that's writing a letter or taking more time with a friend or taking the time to listen.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of my work in the last number of years, initially I think it came a lot out of my own maternal contexts, but now sort of thinking more broadly about human relations and more than human relations in general, how we need to be more intentional about taking time to take care.
Yeah.
If we want to have any hope of, sort of surviving.
I saw a friend over the weekend for a walk. That's the only way I'm seeing people at the moment outside the person I live with. And she had been having quite a lot of troubles with her teenage daughter. They had been clashing quite a lot. Very familiar story there. And she had taken a course in, and I can't now remember what it's called. It's a sort of negotiating techniques that they use, like in Middle Eastern, like peace talks and things like that around, I think sort of reconciliation. So she said one of the key things that she learned from it was to really listen to her daughter, to really listen to what the need was. So if her daughter is spending 3 hours on her phone, which is what my friend doesn't want her to do, rather than just say, "Give me your phone," or "That's it, you're in trouble," she'd say, "Okay, so why does my daughter feel the need to be on the phone for 3 hours? What is the need there? Oh, it's a need for connection. It's a need to be part of a community. The daughter herself is quite socially anxious, so for her to kind of connect via technology is easier perhaps than in person." And she said it's really transformed their relationship because she's actually started to listen to her daughter. And then in response to her daughter's needs, she's then able to be more clear about what her needs are. Well, yes, okay, I understand that you have this need for connection via your phone, but I also have the need to spend half an hour with my daughter having dinner. And so, yeah, this thing of actually feeling listened to just seems quite potentially transformative. I mean, obviously some of us pay a small fortune going to therapy in the hope that we might be listened to. So yeah, that seems to be really important with your, really slowing down. You're not just receiving letters and excerpting them, but the process of embroidery itself is a slow one. So really thinking
Well, yeah,
about,
I think you really hit on something there. It's, it's not just the need to care for another person, but it's the need to be listened to and to feel heard. And yeah, that story is so familiar, but we're related to children and technology. And I think something I try to talk with my own kids about is, what is it that you're getting? Are you feeling listened to? Are you actually feeling heard in these social communities? I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so I think for me, part of finding different ways of slowing down and finding different modes of connection has to do with being more intentional about those choices and finding spaces and modes of being that actually are life-giving and not just mindless attempts at some vague connection.
And it's interesting that your work isn't sort of image-based. I mean, it's obviously language and then this more sort of abstract work with the paper, the marbled, is it marbled, the paper? Because I think so, you know, one of the things that, you know, I'm obviously not of the generation that grew up with the internet, but I feel very, I feel a lot of pain for people who grew up in this culture of such visual exposure, you know, where the sort of selfies and visual perfection is such a currency and such pressure on everyone. I mean, obviously young women, but, you know, young men and everybody. So I think it's really interesting that you're thinking about writing and listening and not that sort of image circulation in that way.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure. I mean, sort of the genesis of that, I think for me has a lot to do with the fact that I also have a life as an art historian, and for years I kept the visual art and art historian parts of my life intentionally very separate. I didn't see much overlap, but when I went back to grad school for an MFA, part of my goal was really to find where those overlaps might be, and I think they had been there probably all along. But this, I don't know, finding a way to give voice to the writing in my visual work felt really important, and yeah, it's interesting how that sort of ended up happening organically.
Yeah. I mean, letter writing, there's a sort of big sort of female culture of letter writing, isn't there? And particularly, I don't know, we think of sort of like the Victorian era where women didn't have much access to public life, but had incredible cultures of intimacy, you know, often through things like letter writing. What do you think has attracted you so much to letter writing?
Oh, I mean, I think there's some of it is that kind of history. I don't know if you've read Margareta Jolly's great book, In Love and Struggle. It's about the 70s feminist letter writers in the US and Britain. And just talking about sort of the second wave feminism and the ways that they engaged with each other through letters, you know, both working out ideas, but also working through personal struggles with each other, you know, using letters as that intentional form of, you know, both connection, but also sometimes vehement disagreement through letters.
Right.
You know, so those are really places of debate as well. But also for me, it comes very much from a personal place of, like I said, I come from a long line of letter writers and weekly letters growing up between parents and grandparents, and, you know, sort of that regular occurrence, the arrival in the mailbox, and, you know, there's a real materiality in my memory of that, of like the one side of the family always typed, you know, on the certain kind of paper, and then there's the sort of material focus of that, the typewritten word and how you can feel the indentations on the page, and then the other side of the family always handwritten, but on the same blue lined half-size paper with a, you know, certain kind of handwriting. So yeah, there's both the personal and maybe more of the historical aspect that are.
That's really reminding me of when I lived in Atlanta for 7 years and then Toronto for 5. And my dad used to write to me, and we'd been really close when I was growing up, but then he got remarried and I didn't get on with his second wife. So we'd sort of grown apart a bit. But he would write to me on these airmail letters. And he was extremely, I would say, cheap. My dad, very money conscious. So he loved the fact that these were, you know, these aerograms were sort of budget conscious, but he would try to squeeze as many words as possible. And then often, you know, there was a lot of humor in his letters. Oh, damn, I'm running out of space. And, you know, it became a real way for us to kind of rediscover each other and reconnect in a way that his second wife didn't like it when I phoned him, and she would always listen in on the phone calls. I don't know. Strange dynamic there. But yeah, we found a real new lease of life through letter writing. It was very pleasurable. I was just thinking
there's a remnant there too, you know, that you then hold on to the letters maybe, whereas a phone call is sort of here and gone.
Absolutely. And that's another thing about emails, isn't it? Is that we don't tend to archive them in the same way, or there's that the materiality is not as strong.
Right. I mean, they all look the same. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking, this phrase, "I hope you're well." I mean, that became such a kind of almost a sort of cliche of emails, didn't it? I do hope this email finds you well. But I was just wondering what they are since March. What are the new cliches? I think I've started to do one that goes something like, "I hope this finds you well, despite everything, despite the horrendous year." Or, I mean, what do you think have been the new?
Oh, let's see. Yeah, I think the ones I've seen most commonly on email have something to say like, "I hope this finds you well in these unprecedented times." It's always about the unprecedented, like this sort of need to acknowledge. It's like a, sort of a preliminary gesture of care in spite of everything.
In spite of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And also a genuine consciousness that people might not be well, that a lot of people have been sick, or they've lost people, or they've had illness, and mortality has been really close. So yeah, I think that's true. Trying to think where else to take this. There's so much that your work touches on. What maybe you could just talk about some of the letters you've received and that have really stood out for you in this current phase of the project.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how usually I think people write very specific stories. Often they're from childhood, feeling cared for by a family member. I guess I've been a little surprised at how many of the stories touch on moments of grief and loss. I think that's often when we notice feeling the most cared for, when we're feeling the most vulnerable.
That's interesting.
So yeah, stories of being cared for after the death of parents, the death of a spouse. Yeah, and maybe the other sort of surprising piece is how a few of the letters speak to gestures of care received by total strangers. Feel, and maybe that's what stands out to somebody, that when someone you don't even know is willing to offer you, to extend a hand, to help you in some way, that makes a dramatic impression.
Exactly. It can kind of restore your faith in humanity, can't it? I mean, obviously care is very, there's such a political dimension to care as well. It's not just a private thing. It's not just through personal relationships, but it's also, caring labor, be it sort of, within healthcare or domestic labor, which is, in both cases, they're either, often devalued, unpaid, invisibilized. I was wondering if there was a sort of political dimension to that as well, of kind of, in a way, making visible some of these, generally feminized as well as often racialized forms of action, which our society hasn't traditionally valued at all, or very, very, has put very low in terms of economic and symbolic value.
Yeah, definitely. I think somebody who visited my work recently said something like your work is very quietly political, and I think there's something to that it's sort of quietly and maybe insistently political in that sense. I'm not interested in hitting people over the head with it, but I think for me, making visible these acts of care that, as you say, often are unseen, often done by certain demographics of people. So for me, there's very much an act of making that visible.
Yeah.
As well as, being in the space, physically embroidering these words. For me, there's a real parallel between the amount of time it takes to embroider words. In that way, it's a real parallel with the amount of time it takes to care for someone else. There's a durational aspect to both of those
Yeah.
elements that's really important to me. Because, you know, as anybody who's a caregiver knows, in any capacity, it's a long haul proposition, you know, that it's not just a one and done. It takes an enormous amount of time to care. And so for me to be able to give a little bit of that back, or to make that visible in a certain way, feels important.
Yeah. And it's often repetitive and potentially boring and messy and dirty. You know, just think about all the dirty work that is done under the aegis of care. It's as Meryl Laderman-Ukeli says in her Maintenance Art Manifesto, you know, maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time. You know, it's the work that's never done. So actually creating moments of contemplation about this work that's never done, I think there's a real poignancy to that.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, it's also, I mean, it's really tied up also with being able to listen to the stories that have been shared with me, to, you know, because it's somebody's taking a risk by participating in this project, by sharing their story, you know, because, you know, they're often intimate. And even if they're sort of more generalized, there's an intimacy in sharing something like that. It's a vulnerability. So for me, there's also a real aspect of needing to honor that, by, you know, listening to the words as I write them, or as I embroider them, you know, and I do try to do it in an approximation of the handwriting that I've.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's,
you know,
really
and
nice.
So that's an interesting process to go through, is to sort of practice writing in someone else's script for a little while first before.
That's interesting.
Yeah, you know, because in a way, I don't know, I feel like I get to know the person a little bit if I figure out, you know, how they form certain letters, and, you know, because everybody has their own idiosyncrasies in the ways that they write. And so to get to know somebody a little bit that way.
That's rather lovely.
Yeah, it's another form.
What if the letter is typewritten? Do you then try to approximate the type?
Yeah, well, then it's just sort of, I guess it's a free for all then, but another reason to request a handwritten letter, I suppose.
I'm just, with this reading group that Gretchen mentioned in the introduction, this Feminist Duration Reading Group, we were asked to put together a podcast on the theme of friendship and feminist organizing. And we chose to invite anyone who's actively participated in the group in the last couple of years, either by leading a session or hosting a session in their home, or inviting us to run a session in the gallery they run, or something like that. And one of the sort of issues that has come up a lot is this idea of kind of reciprocity through listening and writing. And there's a wonderful story which has come up in a couple of the contributions, and it's from the Italian feminist movement, and from this example that happened in the 70s, when there were two women who participated in a sort of evening class for people who didn't have high school education. It was offered, so it came out of the trades union movement, but then some feminist educators decided to kind of use it to work predominantly with sort of women who were, you know, housewives and so on. And there were two women in this group. It was called the 150 Hours Schools, and they had a very similar background, sort of rural background. Obviously, didn't, you know, hadn't gone to high school, but one of them was a very talented writer as well as speaker, and the other really struggled. And the one who struggled constantly tried to tell her story, but in a way that was frankly quite repetitive and annoying to the other members of this women's evening class. And finally, the one who did have a skill for writing wrote her story and gave it to her. And it's written up, Adriana Cavarero, the feminist philosopher, has sort of written it up as an example of what she calls reciprocal narration, because the act of being witnessed and the act of then having her story put into shape proved really kind of transformative for the woman. And she carried this story around constantly in her purse and kept reading it. So it was seeing herself in some kind of formal narrative narrated by somebody that she knew and trusted, that kind of gave her a real sense of herself. She said until that time, her life had been one big no. She considered her life to be quite empty and disappointing, but having this narrative gave her a real sense of herself as a kind of unique being. So yeah, I find
Wow,
that
that's
such a beautiful story.
Yeah, I mean, to be heard and to really feel seen in that way.
Exactly. But with that kind of mediation, it's not just in the moment, it is also, so that kind of, I think, brings us back to your process of that sort of meditative.
Yeah. Again, I think it's about the act of taking the time, you know, because the woman who took the time to listen to that story, to put it into her words, to craft it in a way that was more maybe attractive to the story itself.
Yeah, exactly. So I know we're sort of at the point when we were thinking of taking some questions. I don't know if there are any out there.
We do have a couple of questions coming in, and just a reminder to everyone that is watching us online as well, you can submit questions in the Facebook comments and we will get them to Rachel and Helena. So I do have one question for Rachel. Have you had any contact with the artist Lenka Clayton, who created a project, Unanswered Letter? I am interested in how your two projects relate to one another.
So I know Lenka Clayton through her artist residency in motherhood, and yeah, through a bunch of the projects that she's done. I think making care visible in an entirely different way, but very evocative. But I don't know the Unanswered Letter project, so Sarah Lynn, I would love to know more about that. I'll look it up, definitely. So unless you want to share something about it, I'd love to hear.
It's kind of interesting, especially related to the way you're describing your work, because the Unanswered Letter project, she sent something out. This was when she had a residency at the Fabric Workshop. She sent a letter to all these museum directors. It was a very kind of complex thing, but it relates to Brancusi's sculpture for the blind. And it's fantastic. It's such a fantastic project. Of course, she went on to publish it, but there's a key aspect of your project that's quite different that I wanted to ask you about. And that was, because when I got back my thank you, the letter that I wrote, they were soliciting letters from all of us in the same way you are, but the letter that then when I got this back, it's Braille. So the certificate, the way of reading it is Braille. Now, I of course know what I wrote, if I find it, you know. But the way that it's really different from your project is, unless I missed it, you did not have a list of people that you're soliciting letters from, right? You're doing that more spontaneously. You're writing to people more spontaneously. And I can say that because I spontaneously got a letter from you when we had a brief interaction ahead of this project at the Saline Art Center. And I'm just wondering how that impulse of to whom are you writing the letters, how that fits into the artistic form of the project.
Yeah, so, I mean, because there are multiple sort of letter projects in this space, and maybe I'll address that in sort of two ways. So for the Taking Care, the embroidery-based project, those are, I mean, they're really open to anybody. I will respond to whoever writes for that project, to respond to the story that they share, and to respond to other things that they write about in the letters. Sometimes they're pretty lengthy, and other times quite short. But for the daily letters, the pandemic epistles, you know, I think when I started in them in March, like I said, it was really a way for me of maintaining connection with other people in a very disorienting time, I think for all of us. And so I didn't really begin with a clear sense in mind of, well, who all am I going to write to? So, I started sort of with the obvious people I'd written to before. I have a number of people with whom I regularly correspond. And so those were sort of the starting points. Yeah, and then over time, sort of think about, well, who would I like to write to? There have been a few letters to my senators about various things. But for the most part, they're the people that I have some personal relationship with, that I want to say something to, and it's ongoing. So.
But it wasn't a data set. It wasn't a data set in the beginning, and then you're having the reciprocal relationship with a set of data. It's as it's flowing. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, and definitely, like the more people respond, then the more I write back to them. So there are certainly there's a couple of people I write to probably once every couple of weeks because we have a pretty active correspondence. Yeah, but no, I think there's a more of a disembodied quality to the Unanswered Letter project, maybe, and certainly a different kind of connection if the letter you're getting you can't actually read. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel and Sarah Lynn. I do have a few more questions coming in. I think one of them might be building off of what you were just talking about, a question about your data collection process and what will you do with it? I'm assuming what will you do with it when your project is finished?
So I'm not sure which. So the data collection, maybe that's what's on display behind you, Gretchen. The data visualization of the daily letters. Yeah, I don't know what I'll do with it. It's continuing to grow since I add pieces of paper for to represent each day. When I've started the project, as I've been writing the letters, I didn't necessarily have a visual component in mind because I write the letters on paper that I've marbled by hand, but then I send them off. I take a photo of the marbled paper, but I haven't maintained any other form of documentation of the letters, other than keeping a list of who I've written to on a particular day. But as this exhibition was coming up, I thought it would be, I don't know, it felt important in some way to represent this daily practice in some form. And Gretchen, I don't know if you can screen share again to show some of the photos of that for people who came in late, but so I decided to do a wall installation of sort of freehand cut paper, also on marbled paper that I've made, and so this sort of grows across the wall, coming out of the desk, sort of where it starts, to this evocation of letter writing and sort of modes of connection, whether it's a tree form or roots or a plant, or sort of the idea that maybe letters could establish kind of root systems, coming out from one individual, but then who knows where it goes, connecting with other people. So, yeah, thanks for the question.
Was muted. Do you use embroidery in any other work, whether personal or exhibition pieces, or was it a specific choice solely for this body of work?
Let's see, I use embroidery in teaching. I guess that would be probably the most closest relation. I haven't done a lot artistically with embroidery before this, other than, for, I suppose, tea towels for use in the home, maybe. I do sort of like that overlap of, artistic and utilitarian work in that medium. But for the last number of years, I've taught embroidery as just part of a foundations class. Partly because I've come to see that it's a real life skill for people to learn for students to learn how to thread a needle. Many of them have never done that before. And then, it's always exciting to see, like this fall when I taught it, suddenly I encountered one of my students out on the green area on campus. She was busy embroidering little flowers onto her jeans. She wasn't working on the class project, but she was, finding new ways to use this form. Whether it's figuring out that you can use this newfound skill to do that or to mend a hole in your sock. And I think students are often surprised at how much they enjoy the process of embroidery. You know, we work very small scale, so it feels, I think, a little low stakes to them. It's not a huge drawing. It's a, you know, small scale project, but you know, they find that they get better at it pretty quickly. It's the repetition, the duration, the time it takes. All of those things I think are important to me in trying to impart something about that to students.
All right, thank you. I have another question, and I think Helena could maybe chime in on this one a little bit too, but how are you part of the larger international movement of artists who are engaging in these ideas?
I don't know, Helena, do you want to go first on that?
I would say that I am part of a, you know, a sort of international movement in the sense that I'm very interested in intergenerational feminisms. So quite a lot of my energy, I'm not really curating exhibitions so much at the moment, partly because I'm doing an MA in writing, so I haven't really got the time, but also because I tired of that rather static kind of curator-artist relationship. And so when I moved back to the UK and I'd been away for quite a long time, I sort of needed to make feminist kin. And I did that partly by setting up a reading group that's very intergenerational and that's focused on feminisms predominantly outside the Anglo-American canon. So we started with Italian feminisms, and we've looked at a lot of sort of European feminisms. And so I've developed a really kind of great network through that. So I'm really in touch with a group in Toronto who are also dealing with similar legacies, and some feminists in other parts of the world, including Australia and Italy, South America. And it's quite modest what we do. We often just exchange texts, or one of the things we do in this reading group is we read out loud, and we spend time, we slow down. So we literally read from a passage together, from an article or a novel or something together, and spend time figuring out what we think is going on. And so in a way it is international, but it's also really local, because before the pandemic, a lot of the time we'd just be in someone's flat, having a vegetarian meal, spending the whole afternoon reading one text. And it's a way of becoming really intimate, both with the material, but sort of with each other, mediated through a bit of writing. So yeah, I think it's taught me a lot. It's such a simple thing, but so we read out loud going around the room. So just hearing different voices, different accents, people with different relationships to English, and then sharing our insights has really opened up materials that I've read on my own and have had really different experiences with. So yeah, that's part of what sustains me.
Yeah, the reading aloud is so evocative. I think it really appeals to me in the way you talk about it. And I think for me, there's so many memories and good things tied up with memories of being read to or reading aloud to someone else. And earlier in this project, I had the chance to do a reading with a friend with whom I correspond. We did a reading of our letters to each other, and that act of sort of rereading our own words to each other. But yeah, reading them aloud had a different tenor. We heard different things through them. We saw different things as we were reading the words. So that was really, eye-opening, I think, for me. And so to hear, so for me to have that sound piece in the gallery is important too, because then it's also like I have people in the gallery with me. They're reading to me, in a sense, even though I'm by myself. Maybe to answer Gretchen's first question, though, yeah, I feel really lucky to be connected to an intergenerational and international group of feminist artists, art historians, mothers. I feel lucky to have been welcomed in. A lot of our connections have been through conferences and publications, there's been such a generosity there for me of being entrusted with texts if I'm the editor, or being invited to submit something, or just to be welcomed into a space. Yeah, so I feel really fortunate for that.
I have a question that maybe relates more to kind of this idea of durational work, and I think you both, again, can comment on it a little bit. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about this exhibition is when we live streamed, Rachel, you and the gallery, cross-stitching, and we did that for an hour. So it was basically just an hour of Rachel sitting and doing this work. And I think it really highlighted these ideas of kind of like what you both were mentioning earlier, this labor, it can be long, it can be boring, it's, you know, not very exciting to watch. So I think it was such a great opportunity to really showcase that part of it. So I'm wondering if you could talk, Rachel, maybe a little bit more about that duration and your physical presence within the gallery space. And then if either of you have, and I know this is kind of a big question, but maybe a little bit about why this aspect of the duration in the body is so important in feminist art.
I mean, for me in the gallery, yeah, I mean, it's a durational performance in a sense. When I first started this, I was surprised by how physically taxing it was to sit somewhere for 4 or 5 or 6 hours and embroider. That you wouldn't expect that, but there's you really notice it physically after a few hours and after a number of days of doing that. But I think it's such a good kind of conceptual approximation of the durational nature of care and listening in general, that it feels like a good parallel to me. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? Sort of the bigger picture?
Yeah, kind of like the bigger, you know, if you guys, either one of you can comment a little bit on the idea, or why is the body and duration, why do these things, you know, keep showing up within feminist art practice?
Okay, I'll just chip in. I mean, I think a huge part of it is sort of back to what we were talking about earlier about sort of honoring and making visible forms of labor that have tended to be feminized, not just labor, but just activity, you know, be it embroidery or cleaning or childcare or, you know, so many domestic tasks. It's about honoring them. It's also about recognizing their value, their essential nature to culture, which has not been acknowledged. So I keep thinking about artists like Janine Antoni. You know, I think she's done so much, and she was she's done a lot of work, hasn't she? Sort of, I mean, I don't think it's what she's doing these days, but back in the 80s or the 90s when she had that work, I think she would dream. She would sleep in the gallery, and then something about the REM emissions, I don't know, that's probably not the right word, would then create a code, and then she would weave in the day, but I think she would unravel. So there's also this thing of, is it Penelope who weaves and unravels every day. So there's also this idea about making and unmaking, which is a really kind of central myth associated with women. It was a way of staving off violence, I think, a bit like storytelling. You know, when this tapestry is finished, I will ... have to get married and whatever, enter the patriarchal regime. So as long as I'm weaving and as long as the fabric is still not finished, I get to escape that patriarchal fate. So weaving and storytelling, I think, very intertwined. And then, you know, really germinal works of feminist art history like Rosika Parker and Griselda Pollock work on like female traditions of embroidery, samplers, which smuggled in subversive, willful sentiments about women's oppression, but in this apparently very neat sort of prim form of the sampler. So I think there's just so much there. that continues to resonate.
Yeah, and with the embroidery samplers, it's been fun to see when I teach embroidery to students how almost every year I have, in recent years, I have a student who comes in and has looked up something about embroidery and suddenly found that, oh, subversive embroidery has become a thing, and it all cycles back around. So it's,
the subversive stitch, that was what it was
yes,
called,
exactly.
wasn't it? Which
Exactly.
is a great
sort of
title.
a whole new generation, finding the subversive power of craft.
Absolutely. And a lot of queer artists, men, women, and non-binary have really found their homes there because of its relationship to the everyday, to the body, to decay, to anxieties about, be it moth infestation or degradation. I mean, it's very loaded.
Mm-hmm.
Why the body? That time was too much for me. It's,
I think for a lot of it, why the body in feminist art and art history, so much of it I think has to do with which bodies have been privileged. So it's, again, I think it's a making visible of other kinds of bodies, other kinds of experiences, in a very insistent kind of way. If we haven't been heard or seen by whoever, then we will be seen,
as well as an objection to the forms of commodification and objectification that certain bodies have been subject to. So it's also about a kind of, it's a reclaiming, but it's also a question about the body and its ubiquity.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. A couple quick more questions and then we will wrap it up. First one, what is the role of the furniture in the space? Rachel, I know you gave me some very specific ideas, but you did not source the furniture, but can you talk a little bit about why you are looking at those styles of furniture?
Yeah, so let's see, I think the furniture list I sent you included a writing desk that I guess I sort of assumed would be wooden. Turned out it was. Yeah, you found some great examples. Thanks to the Helena community for stepping up and donating their furniture for a few weeks. So I wanted something that would evoke, this tradition of letter writing. So it's a wooden desk and a wooden chair, and then there's another wooden desk on which the embroidery supplies live, as well as Gretchen had a great rocking chair in her office that I could use for to sit in and to embroider over the hours. There's also an ironing board with an iron in the space. It's a very practical kind of thing to iron the embroideries when they're completed before hanging them up, but also, sort of that evocation of ironing board living in the space. I think it has a lot to sort of say. So I guess they're, both practical and sort of conceptually intentional parts of the installation.
All right, and one last question. Can you, and this one I think is geared towards Rachel, but Helena, again, if you have any comments, feel free to chime in, but can you talk more about your listening practice and how it translates to your into your visual practice?
My listening practice. I don't know, I guess I feel like a big part of our learning as humans is about developing some sort of listening practice to other people, to the people around us. So in terms of how that translates, I think a lot of my work in the last number of years has been focused on figuring out different ways to listen. So whether it's listening to someone through a reciprocal exchange of letters, a correspondence. I really consider letters to be an active form of listening. They're an invitation to listen, sort of, I think what I wrote to Helena a while ago, I really almost would say they're almost a contractual agreement to listen, to care for someone else in that way, that, you know, by sending a letter, you're implying, I think you're saying to the person, I will offer to listen to you if you write back. Yeah, and then, you know, with the embroidery that's happening in the space, I certainly consider that a form of listening to the words that have been shared with me, you know, listening to this person's story. Maybe especially if I don't know them, I have to kind of imagine, fill in the blanks. But if there's a real intimacy with that. In some of the work that I didn't bring for this, I've been making a series of drawings where I use tiny handwritten script to form the lines of the drawings. You know, and again, for me, it's listening. It's also duration, listening to the words as I write them in these tiny scripts. But it also takes a long time. Yeah, I don't know, Helen, if you want to chime in on anything you see happening with the listening.
Oh, God. Well, I mean, there is the process of editing. So you're not just reproducing the letters, you're kind of zoning in on certain phrases or sentiments. So there's also the sense of kind of getting to the heart of the story, perhaps. So yeah.
That's an interesting parallel, you know, thinking about, you know, my work in art history and as an editor and writer, you know, how again, there's this overlap that I hadn't necessarily thought about before this. So
yeah, so it's an element of shaping, isn't it? And that's, I think, we don't just want it to be heard, we also want to have we want to get a sense back of, well, what have you heard?
Yeah.
So I think that's important to what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, is that a good place to stop? We're at an hour already.
Probably.
Great. It's just going to say thank you so much again. Helena, it was great to have you here. And I appreciate all of your comments and your insights on Rachel's work. And Rachel, again, it's always a pleasure to talk with you as well.
Much.
Any final comments, or we can just wrap it up?
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah.
I just want to say before we finish, I thank you to the NEA who we were able to do this program through grant funding from them as part of our continued programming from the Salina Biennial. So we appreciate that. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, Rachel is doing a virtual sewing circle this Sunday from 2 to 4 p.m. I believe you can register on our website, and it should also be on our Facebook page, and that'll be through Zoom. So people are welcome to join us and bring their own stitching projects along and stitch and visit and talk more about some of these things that came up today. So, all right. Thank you again so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.